Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Nurse Converse. I'm your host, Jeri Ford, and I am so excited to be with you guys today. And I could not be more thankful and honored to have been voted in the top 10 for this season. But let me tell you, trying to find a single topic to cover today was a challenge, as I have so many ideas. I've been a pediatric nurse for over 12 years. 10 of those years I was a travel nurse, which I joke and say that that's sort of like geriatric travel nursing because that's a long time to be a travel nurse. I also have started my own business, and I could speak about any of those things at length because I love talking about it, but I wanted to spice things up a bit. I truly believe us nurses are much more than what we bring to the bedside, and in order to live our best, happier lives, we need help being happier outside of work as well. Part of that outside happiness is dating and relationships. Surely by now, everyone knows that dating a nurse is a trending topic, from viral TikTok videos to comedian jokes. The list goes on and on. Even the Instagram page, Nurse Life RN, which RIP EB, we miss you so much. That page he used to screenshot all of the dating messes that nurses got themselves into and would post it. And truthfully, I miss it. Anyway, nurses and dating and relationships can be both glamorized sometimes and sometimes the butt of the joke, depending on how you look at it. Jack Harlow raps about wanting to date a nurse in one of his songs. And my friend and I recently went to a comedy show, and we were roasted for like 20 straight minutes about how wild it is to date a nurse. To be fair, we were in the front row, so we sort of asked for it. But all of that to say that it led me to believe that this would be a hot topic, not only because of my personal wild dating stories, but because everyone else seems to think it's popular too. Which, never in a million years did I think I would find someone so perfect for this episode, but I found a lovely angel who is not only a marriage and family therapist, but also loves to work with healthcare workers. Once we chatted forever, she was so warm right off the bat, and once I saw that she also had red hair, just like me, I was like, this has got to be meant to be. So please welcome my guest, Danielle Palomares. Danielle, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Jeri. I'm so happy to be here. Yes, I love that it's not lost on me. We both have our matching red hair. Yeah.
I know. I feel like it's a weird coincidence, but I'm here for it.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. I am an associate marriage and family therapist based in Pasadena, California. I coined myself a trauma, attachment, and sex therapist because I work extensively with relationships, and relationships intersect with trauma. They obviously intersect with intimacy and, of course, attachment. And I work extensively too with healthcare providers, the LGBTQ plus community, and I do a lot of individual and couples therapy.
That's amazing. So just a little quick blurb too, why healthcare workers, or how did you find yourself seeing them a lot too? Yeah.
Yes. Well, I have loved a healthcare worker for the last 9 years. I have a partner that is an ICU attending. And so I have had a up close and personal look at what y'all go through, and it is a lot.
And ICU attending is the peak of that. So I can understand that you have seen it firsthand for sure.
Yeah. And I just appreciated too, just how little support there is just on a systemic level for healthcare workers to get, the mental health access and resources. And not all clinicians necessarily understand some of the nuances that you all deal with.
Right. And, I know, just a side note, some hospitals do provide, therapists to talk to, but as far as personal life or dating and relationship specific, it's almost like they're still your therapist from your employer, from the hospital.
Right.
So I know that there are a lot of people who still feel not super 100% comfortable actually coming to them. So it's definitely a need.
There's so much stigma there. And I mean, I have to say that's why most of my clients don't use their insurance when they see me, because we do have to do that, the diagnostic codes, and, your employer can look at the notes. It's very complicated. So yeah, there's so much stigma, embedded there.
Yeah. I didn't even think about that. That's probably so true. So this clearly is a hot topic. And to start off, I sort of want to be like a little bit vulnerable and just like open up about what led me here personally to this topic. and why I feel it might be helpful to others, or at least it was to my friends. As I said, I've been a travel nurse for like 10 years of my career. And fun fact, you know who has a less serious reputation about dating than nurses in general? It's travel nurses. So I've had my fair share of dating stories and my fair share of men, just not taking it seriously, things like that, which is definitely not always unique to nurses, but definitely when they hear travel nurses, they're like, bing, bing, bing.
Totally.
Yeah, so I've had my fair share of dating stories, and sadly, we don't have enough time to share them, although my friends definitely wish that I could, because that would be an episode for sure. But all of these stories sort of led me to this situationship that ended earlier this year. And I will start off by saying the fact that I have to use the word situationship is a red flag in and itself, but I digress. I bring up like this specific incident and scenario not because of the actual person, like obviously he was no good, but overall it's more about me and the fact that I sort of hit my personal dating breaking point. We had this particular ending it conversation, which I never recommend. It was an in-person conversation, and I left that feeling intimidated, scared. I was yelled at, called names.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, called name. I remember getting to my car, and obviously I was really shaken up. I was trying to get over like the fact of like being scared, and I was still scared in that moment. But more than that, I just distinctly remember sitting in that car and saying to myself, Jeri, what are you doing? How are you in a situation, again, with a man that clearly does not care about you, and you've spent all this time spinning your wheels trying to not necessarily make him, but trying to make it work, sort of, when there were so many red flags to begin with. So it was sort of this come to Jesus meeting with myself. I've had several of those in the past, but this was, again, sort of like a breaking point for me where I'm like, all right, I'm actually done with this.
Wow.
It led me to seeing my therapist, like a therapist for the first time ever. I saw one like briefly years ago, but this was like more serious. And I just remember talking to her, and after I told her the entire story of this person from top to bottom, the gaslighting, every single glaring red flag that I take total responsibility for overlooking, her first words were to me, it sounds like you escaped something that would have turned into violence. And those words hit me like a ton of bricks, because I just hadn't gotten to that level of processing yet. And then she also said, I'm not surprised that you're a nurse. And I'm like, why is that? And she said, a lot of your patterns that I'm picking up are typical of someone who's in a giving and like a caregiving role. And so obviously that opened up like an entire other can of worms. And I'm like, all right, I need to start thinking about this in other ways. And I saw my story and so many other of my countless friends who are also single and nurses in the healthcare world, or also in relationships. I mean, just because I'm single doesn't mean that, people in relationships are struggling with similar things as well. And by the way, if you're listening to this thinking like, man, this sort of sounds like more of a personal problem than relating to nursing, all I can say is I agree. I feel like it's a little bit of both. But that's all to say that that's what sort of led me here today. And I just want to help like any of my fellow nurses who find themselves falling into these stereotypical tendencies and patterns, whether it's in dating or relationships. And I just know that like if this nurse can be helped by a therapist and help being like a better person outside of the hospital, then I'm going to be a better nurse inside the hospital. So that's what got me to this point today.
Wow, Jeri. I mean, just a couple reflections. I mean, as you're speaking about like this is a personal issue, what I can hear though is that it intersects with your role as your therapist, pointed out. And there are intersections there that I'm excited we're going to talk about. And, and thank you for your vulnerability. I imagine there's so many people listening that can just completely relate, to the story you just named. And it was interesting to watch you as a somatic focused therapist that does a lot of trauma work. As you started telling the story about that breakup, I noticed your body start tension, like you were tensing, your voice raised. Like I could see so much how that moment, impacted you.
Oh
And
my gosh.
yeah,
I didn't even realize that. That's crazy.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, the word intimate partner violence certainly popped into my head, right?
Hmm.
That did sound like the behaviors you were on the receiving end of were just totally not okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that leads us. We talked a lot in our conversation about IPV, about the prevalence on just a macro level of intimate partner violence in so many relationships.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's crazy that you picked up on that. I don't even like realize. Sometimes I do. I feel it a little bit. I'm more noticeable about it. In this moment, I didn't, but it's
Of
totally true.
course.
It's still there. I'm still
Yes.
working through it. I still think about it. I'm like, oh my gosh, that
How
was the
human of
worst.
you. I
Yeah.
always tell my patients how human of you. Of course, it takes a while for the body to catch up. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so true. Um, but I also know that this is not unique to me. It's of course
Mm-hmm.
not unique to nurses. This
No.
is something that happens to everyone. Of course, there are patterns that we fall into, tend to, but we can get into that a little bit later. But overall, like, what are the most common patterns you see when you are talking to nurses or healthcare workers?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many here. But I want to say that the picking up on the red flags, that can be really challenging for anybody, especially in the throes of like that new relationship energy.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we're going to talk a bit about the importance of self attuning and doing like a values and boundaries inventory. But in terms of specifics to nurses, I would say that there's a lot of, this is low hanging fruit, but there's a lot of moral injury, vicarious trauma that really impacts the ways that nurses are able to show up in partnership, obviously. Of course, you spoke earlier to this archetype of the caretaker, the caregiver. Oftentimes, nurses are parentified children in their families of origin too. I see a lot of overlap there, and I see
Mm-hmm.
your face as you made a face right there. So something landed in that.
Absolutely, totally, yeah.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of anxious. Of course, I'd say there's like a balance there. I've seen avoidant patterns from nurses too, and nurses are not a monolith, right? But overall, I tend to see more of the anxiously attached pursuer energy on the whole,
Mm-hmm.
almost like a I can fix them kind of reenactment going on. Yeah.
Yes.
So those are just a few to start.
Yes. I feel like I was watching a reality show recently where the girl said, I'm Mrs. Save a Man. And
Uh
I
huh.
laughed really hard because I was like, oh, I'm also Mrs. Save. Like, you just feel like, okay, I'm caretaking, I'm caretaking, I'm caretaking. Like, I can do it for him too. And even if, I mean, that's totally not something you are consciously making a choice to do, because obviously no one would pick that.
Totally.
It does seem like something that's super subconscious, though.
Yeah. And I mean, I can't help but think of like the Beauty and the Beast paradigm.
Yeah.
Even in children's movies, and that this brings us to the systemic conversation too of that we are all inundated with
Mm-hmm.
so many toxic messages
Mm-hmm.
around partnerships. This idea that the protagonist has been locked up in a dungeon and her father was like almost like unalived by this guy, but we're having a
Yeah.
scene here of like there's something sweet and almost kind in him. Maybe in time I'll be able to fix him. And it's yeah, and we, these messages sink into our bodies, we learn them, and then we enact them.
Yeah. I'm like, you had mentioned that when we talked to before, and it got me thinking too. I'm like, okay, my favorite one was The Little Mermaid, of course, such a good
Uh-huh.
one. And she is selling her soul to an evil person just to be
Yeah.
able to go to shore. I'm like, oh
She's
my gosh.
she's self-abandoning.
Right.
She's not doing self-attunement, and yeah, she's self-abandoning in order to make herself, in order to get the prince, right? So
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
It's crazy. Also, I think I remember too when we were like chatting just in general. And I feel the same. Like, I have gone into certain relationships thinking I have a good pulse for myself. And to a certain level, I do. I
Yeah.
mean, one of the things that in this most recent one, just to bring it back to that, is he was, calling me these names and saying, you're this, you're this. And I do have enough confidence in myself and self-awareness to know that I am not those things. So it didn't affect me in that way. However, I know you were mentioning, and I think it's true that some people do go into relationships not completely knowing themselves.
Oh, 100%. I mean,
Right.
I work a lot too, not just with healthcare workers and hospitalists, but I work a lot with therapists. And even with therapists, it's interesting to see that it is hard to organize to assemble one's inner world, to
Right.
understand why we're feeling certain things. What are they telling us about our attachment longings and our needs? And then how are we showing up in our partnerships? Even therapists have a hard time with those skills, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Um, yeah. And I know another one too is, I think this is probably not even specific, which I know we'll get more into like in a little bit, like specific just nursing issues or issues, but I know like a boundary thing is, I personally have
Yeah.
a boundary issue. I mean, more than just the red flags thing, whew, that's like my number tip top. Like,
Yeah.
I wish I could get into examples specifically of all these red flags I've overlooked over the years, but also I would say my number two thing is like boundaries in relationships and being able to assertively make those.
Yeah. Whenever I hear that, to me, again, it goes back to this idea of knowing thyself, right? Because a boundary is really our job to, enforce, to name, to know what it looks like, and to know what the consequence is if there is an overreach or an overstep. And so boundary work has a lot to do with getting very explicit around what is and is not okay for us and our needs.
Right.
Yeah. And then being able to articulate that. Easier said than done, right?
That's what I was going to say. I'm like, what if he gets to the point where you're like, I actually don't know, or it's like, something feels uncomfortable, but how do you express it? I mean, is that something obviously someone can work through in therapy or with somebody?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeri. So I do something called parts work. It's kind of a certain kind of branch and style of therapy that can be really helpful when it comes to dating, and especially folks that do find themselves making a lot of concessions, self-abandoning, like Ariel, trying to fix the
Right.
beast, right? And parts work is sort of this idea that like we do have a core, wise adult self that we can access that has certain qualities like it's our calm self, our grounded self. It's the self that understands what our values look like. And then we have these other parts that show up. And I'm sure most of us can relate to this idea of like one part of us wants something and the other part is saying, don't do that thing. And so it sounds like for many people, when they go into dating, it's almost like that wise self energy leaves the room. And we have this other part that shows up and blends and takes over and says, you know what? Let's forget about all that. Let's forget about that. And usually that part is trying to get something. It has a goal. Maybe it's connection. Maybe it's to be seen and loved finally. But whatever it is, unfortunately, sometimes that part, when we let it take the wheels, is usually a very young part. It can really
Yeah.
cause the car to go off the road.
Ooh, it sure can.
Yeah.
I am just like laughing because I'm like, this parts thing, I remember we touched on it before a little bit, and as you're like explaining it again, I'm like, that is me to a T. I mean, I am so capable of pinpointing if it's someone else that's going through, like if it copy and pasted my situation in someone else, another
Right.
nurse, another friend, I can see the red flags and tell them exactly what to say and cut it off here. Like, this is not good. This is going down a wrong path based on my experiences. But when it's me, you're right. It's an entire other part that takes over.
It's hard to see the forest from the trees sometimes when we're in the thick of it,
Right.
Which is why therapy can be helpful to sort of make some of these unconscious processes that we've never really looked at, a bit more in the front, a bit more conscious. Yeah.
Right. So these are, I feel like we could talk about so much. These are like, kind of overall patterns, but like if we narrow down super like specifically and hone in onto things, which I know we touched on a little bit, but what are sort of the things that you see specific to nursing, I mean, healthcare workers in general, but specific to
Yeah.
nurses and the patterns that they tend to fall into?
Yeah. I mean, I think we could go straight into just the biggest, pattern I notice, which is vicarious trauma. I have this on my this wonderful book, Trauma Stewardship. I don't know if you've ever read it, but I have it
I
here on my
have not.
desk. I've probably read it like 5 times. Laura Vandernoot Lipsky, and it talks
Okay.
all about the impacts of vicarious trauma. And
So explain a
yeah,
little bit what that means. What is vicarious trauma?
yeah, it's trauma that you have, that gets stored in your own body because you've witnessed a lot, because of your
Oof.
role as a caretaker, as a healer, and I think it's a very minimized form of trauma, especially within the system. You got to tough it out, right? Like you got to keep on going. You got to compartmentalize.
Yeah, you have no other option.
Yeah, but the reality is it does get stored. It does make an impact. When you watch people die week after week, when you are bearing witness to so many painful and traumatic losses and stories, that of course impacts you. And if you don't have some really intentional ways to discharge that, it will steep into every corner of your life, including your dating and relationships.
Yeah, oh gosh, it's so true. And it's important that you mentioned that too, just because, I mean, just thinking about relating it, obviously I've seen that in my past relationships that seeped in all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
also, I feel like that would seep in more in relationship, but also when relating it to dating, it seeps in there too. I mean, I just, even this past week, just as an example, I
Yeah.
was asked, I have a love-hate relationship with the apps. We all do. I'm currently on, I am currently thinking about being back off, but I just know that this past week, I've had two different possibility of dates, and like maybe the beginning of this week. And last week, honest to God, was probably one of the hardest weeks I've had in my entire 12-year career. The amount of just traumatic stories on top of many patient deaths. I mean, so much
Wow.
so that the hospital therapist came in to talk to our unit. And I have never seen that happen in my whole year. So I mean, I know that's like an extreme version. Not every week is like that. But in this particular instance, I remember both of these potential dates are not really taking the reins very much. They're not saying like, here's a time, here's a date, here's a place. And I need that so much,
Mm-hmm.
especially on weeks like that, and especially starting off, because it's already a little bit exhausting to meet someone new, which I realize it is for them too. But on top of the week I had, I don't have the wherewithal, and I can't even wrap my head around making plan to meet a stranger. I need you to do it. But then if you come off too harsh and aggressive, like, oh, you're not making this plan, blah, 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 then I'm like, I don't want to sound like a crazy person either. So it's this just back and forth battle with yourself about like what you
Yeah.
need, and just truly mental and emotional exhaustion from the week that you just had.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I hear you. I hear you. And to use a little bit of that parts language we were talking about earlier, I hear
Yeah.
the struggle. I hear one part of you saying, we really need support. We really need someone else to do the labor on the
Yeah.
planning of these dates because this week I don't have the space. And then I hear this other part that is saying, we can't tell them that. Don't tell them that. Because if you tell them that, and I imagine there's some fear there. You're going to maybe scare them away, or you're going to, you said, come on too strong, right?
Yeah.
And so then those two parts are really battling it out. And I guess I'm curious about what you did do. I kind of want to know which part
Well,
won.
with both of them, actually, we sort of had like a loose day planned.
Mm-hmm.
And that day came around. All we had was the actual day. That day came around. It was the morning of that day. And I hear nothing. So that to me is like, I'm good here because I'm exhausted. You probably should have reached out to confirm plans a little bit beforehand and you didn't. So that's what happened with that. But I do think, though, that if one of them or either of them would have come forward and said, like, how's Sunday 11 a.m. coffee date here?
Right.
Perfect. Absolutely
Right.
perfect. So then I can have a little bit of an advance notice. I have like it doesn't have to be too exhausting, you know, that's like not exhausting. You know, it doesn't have to be something big and spectacular. It's just kind of like make a plan.
Right. And you know,
Right.
this is the, I think we talked about this too last week about making the implicit explicit. So the challenge
Oh,
here
yeah.
though is that everyone is coming in with their own unique blueprint around expectations, you know, beliefs around dating, what they want, whether they're on the relationship escalator, you know, progressing towards marriage or not. And
Right.
so it is hard because I hear that that was a real need for you that week, a need that really should have been honored. And yet at the same time, I can't help but wonder if that part that is worried about scaring them away is actually getting in the way of you articulating those needs to people because they really might not know.
Yeah, that's probably true. Um, Sort of along those lines too, I remember we talked about, you know, the parts. In my mind, I feel like a mudgeon part had like a little devil and a little angel. So
Yeah.
like along those same lines, let's say we make it to the first date and then we're on this date and they're like, I'm like, oh man, this was a rough week. And every nurse I know can relate to this
Mm-hmm.
person in front of me saying, oh yeah, my week was rough too. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
because in my head, I'm like, oh, really? Did you see 6 pediatric patients pass away this week? Because I imagine that you didn't. But that's like the
Yeah.
devil part on my shoulder because you don't want to, that's not very nice, but it does make you originally have that reaction. But then I have the angel over
Sure.
here being like, he's just trying to relate. He's not
Uh-huh.
diminishing what you have. So it's just this struggle always. And I feel like, man, my nurse friends and I talk about this constantly, that
Yes.
it's a struggle. And then you don't want to be like, well, mine was actually really bad because, I mean, imagine I said, oh, I lost 6 children this week
Right.
to a
Right.
first date. And they're like, oof, like, you know, like, again, I'm worried that that's going to scare somebody off.
Yeah. Yeah. So I hear these two pieces. There's the piece around whether or not to share certain pieces of what you hold during your week, because that might overwhelm and kind of
Right.
scare them. Right. And then there's this other part around feeling invalidated because your own experience is so intense and is so traumatic that when someone else
Mm-hmm.
comes in and says, well, me too, that can be very frustrating and invalidating,
Yeah,
right?
a little bit.
Yeah, of course. And I can't help but also think about some of the, not to say that this is specific to this situation, Jeri, but just backing up to that conversation around vicarious trauma, that some of
Right.
the symptoms of that are an inability to listen, an inability to hold space for other people. It's a reduced capacity for empathy. It's ironic because
Mm-hmm.
we go into these fields as healthcare providers with so much empathy. That's why most of us
Right.
are here, because we care,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And the vicarious trauma and the exposure to so many of these events chip away little by little at our capacity to really hold space for example, like on that date with another
Yeah.
partner who said, yeah, I had a really hard week too, which
Mm-hmm.
is his truth, right?
Yeah.
um, um, so it's both and I imagine.
Yeah. And I have to consciously take a step back and say, I don't want to be that person that's like, I have the hardest job and sorry you don't. Because that's not true. I think
Mm-hmm.
there's logically, I know that's not true. In that moment, that's my gut reaction. And I know that that's something that, yeah, nurses struggle with. So I can see that being not only just on a first date, like a trauma dumping situation, but also holding that, being able to, or having to work on holding that space when you're actually in the relationship too.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
can't help but think too about that was a good sigh, by the way. The release
Like,
of all that. Oh, yeah.
yeah.
That's good. I can't help but also think about one of the challenges that healthcare workers face and nurses
Hmm.
face is whether or not you want to date someone in the field,
True.
because on one hand, they will have a greater sense of potentially empathy and understanding and a lived
Hmm.
understanding. And they may also have their own, struggles unique to being a
Yeah.
healthcare worker. Whereas a
Right.
person on the outside, there may always be this sense of just they will never be able to truly empathize with your lived world and experience. And so how can you
Yeah.
resource yourself with colleagues, community, friendships, and other people who can
Hmm.
offer that kind of support during those weeks?
Right. That's a whole nother struggle too, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you tend to see nurses falling for certain personality types? Is or I know
Yeah.
I do personally, but I'm like wondering if
Mm-hmm.
that stems from my personal things or if it's something you see
Yeah.
nursing specific or healthcare worker specific.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are some specific differences based on subspecialty, which is probably a podcast for another
Oh,
day. But
ooh,
specific
yeah,
to
that's interesting.
yeah, but specific to nurses, I would say that anxiously attached
Mm,
archetype. This is the person who has always had to maybe be the parentified child. They had to be the child in their family, perhaps. They had to caretake for other people. They weren't given the chance to be the kid.
mm,
That person often finds themselves in healthcare in these kinds of roles, reenacting those patterns. Specific to dating, I see a lot of anxious attachment, a lot of pursuing energy,
mm-hmm,
trying to pursue, trying to pull the other person in to get them to meet their needs.
mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's a really big pattern.
And I know this is like go to therapy, but what is something we can do to not be that way? I mean, go to
Yeah.
therapy probably, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, both for anxious attachers, folks that
Mm-hmm,
are more on the avoidant end, and then the disorganized attachers, they all share a similarity, which is that more often than not, when they were kids, when things got tough, they really didn't have good ways for being supported and getting that kind of secure attachment.
mm-hmm,
And then those patterns that they learned with caregivers usually are reenacted as adults. So it's very common, for example, if I'm working with, oh gosh, like a couple, and one partner is more of the pursuer, anxiously attached, and is
mm-hmm,
kind of always leaning in, maybe is more angry, and the other partner like shows more anger when their needs aren't getting met. And this other partner is more of the withdrawer, the shut down, the avoidant. Typically when I look at both sides, their parents, we see some
mm-hmm.
very interesting similarities in how
Wow.
they did as children. So,
Yeah,
and yeah, so processing that in therapy can be certainly fruitful.
right. And so what I'm hearing is that this whole thing is about recognizing patterns. I feel like that's the first step. And
Mhm.
then taking the steps to do something about it or work on whatever that pattern is going
Yeah.
forward. All we can do is just try to be better people for ourselves, but also for those that, are around us and that we love and care about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
I feel like we could talk about this for, for hours. I
I
have
know.
so many, as you've been like talking, I have been like thinking about, oh, I should this, but we got to stay on track. But there's so many good things that we could talk about here. I guess like just to recap a little bit, what's your just like key either action items or key takeaway for this topic in nurses?
Yeah, yeah. So a couple quick things, first of all, just overarching, if you are someone that is in a violent partnership, if you're in a DV relationship, or if there's signs of psychological abuse going on, there's help. I put a lot of my patients, I funnel them to the hotline.org for resources. So I just want to throw that out to begin. If you are
Okay.
someone that's in a relationship that has those traits,
Yes.
reflecting, nurses can really spend some time reflecting on their relationship to vicarious trauma and how that might be showing up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Figuring out strategies for self-care, trauma processing, getting themselves in that grounded kind of wise energy as much as possible. Easier said than done when you're in a culture of burnout, I know, but
Yeah.
that would be really important to do.
Mm-hmm.
Spending time actively getting to know yourself and self-attuning before you go out on dates. You have to really be able to understand your own emotional world, your needs and longings. Do you attune to your own needs and longings? If you're not attuning to your own needs, it's going to be really challenging for an other to do so. Do you feel
Right.
safe communicating those needs to other people? What are the stories that you tell about yourself and the world when those needs aren't getting met? That this is all very important work that ideally folks do before they try to loop someone else into their inner world. And then how is all of that coming up on the inside informing how they show up? How, what do they do?
Right. I think also something you said to me that was just in our conversation about this podcast, I'm like, oh my gosh, she's kind of giving me little tidbits too, is just when you finally get to a point where you know what your boundary is, a red flag that you're not willing to accept. And you are so far as to know that you need to speak up and you say something. I remember you telling me sort of being willing and okay with the fact that that might push them away.
Yeah.
And be okay with that being the consequence, because
absolutely,
that means that they weren't right for you.
Absolutely. I think the question is, what would it mean to be okay with scaring off the wrong people? Mm-hmm. What is scary about that to different parts on the inside?
Right.
Yeah. Of risking losing people that are not for you, because that really is what dating should be. Dating should be a workshop in rejection, a workshop in saying no, a workshop in turning away the wrong options, as opposed to a workshop in saying yes to, and it is interesting too, just as a total aside, oftentimes when I'm working with my patients, they'll be like, oh, I've gone on so many dates. I funneled through so many people. And then we actually take an inventory and it's like, oh, I've actually gone on 5 dates in 2 years, or I've been on 10 dates and and it's like, you actually have to meet a lot of people and learn how to get comfortable saying no. And to find those matches that are right for you.
Got to kiss a lot of frogs.
Yep. Yeah.
That's what they say.
Yeah.
So that's amazing. And this is like so helpful. And I hope it helps somebody else. I know too, can you mention the book again, the Vicarious Trauma book?
Yeah, this has been a great one. It's called Trauma Stewardship, an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others, by Laura Van Dernoot-Lipsky. It's great. It has some really great strategies for dealing with vicarious trauma.
I will definitely read up on that one. I feel like that is so specific to nurses, 100%.
Oh, yeah.
I know that when I was going through my own journey and talking to my therapist, she recommended something that falls into all of this is the book called Codependent No More.
That's a great one.
That was wonderful. Even if there were chapters that I didn't personally relate to myself, some I definitely did. There were some that I didn't, but I saw those patterns reflected in other family members. That happen sometimes too, or just ones that I'm like, oh, I could see how. So it was helpful regardless of whether some of the chapters I could relate to, but there were some that I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so helpful. And then I remember you mentioning an attachment style book as well.
Yeah. And also the book right now there's Attached, which is a pretty famous book. And then the one that comes to mind too is CPTSD, From Surviving to Thriving. I think that's by, I don't want to get this wrong. I think it's Pete Walker. And that one is great because I think there are really, so many of these issues, and we talk about relationships and attachment, we can't not look at what happened to us, what happened before, what was our childhood like. And a lot of complex trauma stems from attachment injury. And so that book is really great because it does break down for folks that might have more acute, attachment injury from childhood. That one's a really good one to look at.
This is amazing, and I can't wait to get my hands on 2 of those books. So so Danielle, you work closely with healthcare worker trauma that doesn't necessarily involve dating, but if they want to find you or they're interested in working with you at all, where can they find you?
Yes, I'm open to serving folks in California, and they can find me at DaniellePalomares.com. They can also connect with me over on Instagram or TikTok for folks that are out of state. That's at Danielle Palomares MFT.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you so much. I can't even begin to describe how awesome I feel like this topic was. And everybody, if you want to hear more from either of us, please reach out and review this podcast on whatever streaming platform you are listening on. My name again is Jeri Ford. And if you want to talk to me, it could be about this episode. It could be about dating, travel nursing, pediatrics, starting a business, whatever it is. I love chatting chatting with nurses. I love mentoring new nurses or other people and just having an honest, open conversation. My Instagram is JeriLynn_89. I think you can also just search Nurse Jeri. And again, please rate and review. Send this episode to a friend you might think need it. And again, Danielle, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
No, thank you, Jeri. It's been so awesome to be here.
Bye, everybody.